RSS Kelvin, go for Starfleet Base.
Starfleet Base, we sent you a transmission. Did you receive?
Kelvin, have you double-checked those readings?
Our gravitational sensors are going crazy here. You should see this. It looks like a lightning storm.
What you've sent us doesn't seem possible.
Yes, ma'am, I understand. That's why we sent it.
Sound is one of those things that really helps sell illusions to convince the audience that these things might actually be real. I was a Trekkie back during the broadcast of the series, and I was very much inspired by the sounds I loved in the original series. So when I was asked to work on the very first Star Wars movie, I took a lot of my inspiration from the sounds that I loved in Star Trek. So naturally, when I had an opportunity to think and conceptualize about sound effects in the new Star Trek, I was very excited because I always want to be part of that whole universe. I love the history of sound effects, and I always feel it's wise to study and do your homework anytime you work on a film. In this case, I felt very strongly that I wanted to connect in some way with the sounds in the original television series. So I set about trying to find out, well, how were these sounds done? It didn't appear initially at first that any of the principal creators of the sounds were still around and available. So I set out on a search, and I went to the studio to see what they might have saved from those days. So I'm on the trail. I'm looking at these old catalogs, looking through the databases, coming here to Paramount Studios to see what I can find in the basements, in the vaults, wherever I can find it, any information pertaining to how the sound effects were done for that original series. So far, only a few things have turned up, but we're going to keep looking. The sounds that were created for the original Star Trek TV show were a quantum jump above anything that had been done on television before. In fact, the Star Trek television series premiered in the fall of 1966. The college I went to didn't receive television. It was too far away from the station. So I asked my father to tape record the shows, and I listened to the first 8 episodes of the original Star Trek before I ever saw the show.
Emergency stations. All decks on fire alert. Neutralize controls.
The amazing thing is that the sounds in that show were so well done. They brought it alive in such a way that I was able to have a visualization for what was going on in the shows just based on what I was hearing. I think what made the original sounds so distinctive and so dramatic was because, first of all, Gene Roddenberry asked their sound editors to create sounds for all the different environments in the Enterprise, as well as for every device, and every button had a different sound. And this was kind of unprecedented in television, to expect that kind of detail, to have a different sound in every room.
You are certain, Doctor, that this pigmentation is the natural condition of this individual?
That's what I've recorded, Mr. Spock.
But the real key to the success of those sounds were that they were musical. Everything about Star Trek was made up of lovely tones and humming sounds, and they might have been electronic sounds, but they were used musically. When a character would press a button on the console, it would make a little melody. And it would tell you that that piece of equipment was really alive and did something. And because they were musical, you had an emotional reaction to them. The fact that the communicator made a cute little chirping sound, as if it were a little animal talking to you, made it all the more interesting, and it sold the idea to the audience that it's really a piece of functioning technology.
Transporter room. Transporter room.
So when I set out to create sounds for the new movie, I wanted to do them musically, and I wanted equipment to have little melodies and distinctive identities to them. Another thing about Star Trek that was important was that aside from the musical tones, they used lots of electromechanical sounds, real equipment. They recorded mechanics and elevator motors and all kinds of, even a hum of a typewriter, an electric typewriter. And they injected those into the show. And it was because they used real sounds that you began to believe that the equipment on board the ship perhaps was real, because it sounded functional. It sounded like it was real. So I was very interested in those two aspects of the sound, which was it being musical and emotional, and some of it was acoustic, real sound, changed a little bit. So it wasn't completely normal, but it sounded real, like it pertained to something that really existed rather than unknown. And that's what gave drama and credibility to the show. I made new sounds for the sliding doors in the Enterprise, and no one can really say exactly what the original sound was. But to me, it sounded like an air hiss and a squeak. And the air hiss is kind of easy. I recorded the doors of a trolley car opening and closing, the compressed air. And the squeak, after listening to it many times and slowing it down, I figured that's a tennis shoe squeaking on a linoleum floor. So my son and I actually spent an evening recording our shoes squeaking on a linoleum floor in the kitchen and mixed that with the air door on the trolley. And I think that was sort of paying homage to the original sound, which is one of those icons in sound that almost all the fans would recognize. What I have on the keyboard right now are all my favorite shortwave sounds. And I've taken the shortwave sounds, filtered them, I've run some backwards, they're run at different speeds, and I've laid them out so I can essentially play shortwave music. And you begin to end up with things like this. And you'd be surprised how much of this material can be used for force fields, for weapons activating, for functions on the consoles in the various spaceships. And it's something that was done in the original Star Trek show, and I've tried to just expand that whole idea, 10 times. I wanted to go back in time and use some retro techniques for producing sound, similar to what might have been used on the original TV series. This version of the Moog came along a little bit after the series, but it represents, you can create sounds on this much in the manner that they might have done. Essentially, it's a bank of oscillators that go to the keyboards. Instead of just having this oscillator frequency, I can bring in another frequency almost the same, but just different enough that the two interact. So you get a wobbly sound. And that's what's used for sliding and activating the transporter. And further down the scale, you can start to do the different rooms, corridors, and places on the Enterprise. Just a wavery tone, very similar to what they did in the original series. Where you go way down here, you're in engineering, or you're, in the transporter room. I mean, it seems simple, this kind of thing, but a lot of material in the original television series was done in a manner similar to this. This is a test oscillator that engineers use to tune up sound equipment, and this is from the 1960s. Could very well have been something like this hanging around the Paramount sound department. And this gives you tones, which if you feed these into a reverb chamber, you get what a lot of people would say is classic science fiction. A device like this was used in Star Trek, and I used it for this new film for creating the warp engines, and I'll demonstrate that. You start at the very lowest frequencies, and you now begin to hit the throttles, and you're going to go to warp speed. This is just a bar chimes. It's used in, or sometimes called a bell tree, and it's commonly used to produce a nice gliss, magical music sound, which is often, actually some of this was used in the original Star Trek, but I was searching for a method by which they might have created the materialization tones in the original transporter. I wanted something like that. It was a magical sound, and I don't know how they did it. I experimented with a lot of different things, and I found that if I started out with the very highest notes here, and I just did kind of a roll, steady like this, you got a really good approximation of something that sounded like dematerialization or materialization. Now, I constructed this apparatus in order to have some control over creating the sound of the photon torpedo. And here at the top, where this coil is hanging, is a little pickup. It's like you'd have on a guitar. It's sensitive to, picks up mechanical vibrations and translates it to sound. If you tap this at the very base, you begin to get the photon torpedo. I came across this by accident many years ago, this sound, and I thought it sounded like the photon torpedo, and I thought that they might have produced the original sound this way. It's kind of lost right now in the studio history as to how this sound was created. It predates Star Trek, it goes back to War of the Worlds, and even is used in some comedy films at Paramount before that. As far as the studio records show, this based on the descriptions in the catalog, this sound was originally created for a Marlene Dietrich film, for a comedy effect of her jumping on her bed. And that's all I know.